we're going to go ahead and start. Appreciate you being here. And the topic today is science and knowledge. And I have prepared a lot of technical information, and I hope I don't bore you to tears with it. I think it's some information that's really amazing. And I want to just put this out before you. Starting, we addressed atheism Wednesday night, and I presented to you how it really got started in earnest, beginning with the publications of Charles Darwin in the 1850s, Origin of the Species, and then followed by The Descent of Man. But it didn't start really going mainstream until like the 1920s, and then going forward until the 1950s and 60s. And since then, over the decades, it's like you have science on one hand, faith on the other hand. And the two concepts are just locked in this unending battle. Just like two wrestlers just locked together, and neither one can pin the other. So I want to ask this question: is there anything in science that points towards God's existence? Now, we know that God is spirit, and he can't be detected through any of the five senses. But is there some circumstantial evidence that points towards his existence? And I want to submit to you that the answer is a resounding yes. Now, two of the things that we're going to take a look at is the theory of evolution, and then we're going to look at some evidences of physics. And for the purpose of this study, temporarily, I want you to indulge me during this time frame. I want you to set aside the book of Genesis temporarily. And I would like for you to look at things through the eyes of a naturalist, through the eyes of scientists, physicists, cosmologists, whatever, that are studying what they claim are the origins of life. And let's see what they see through their eyes. And let's see if we can draw some conclusions. Now, if you look at it through, and also pretend like you are a jurist sitting on a jury. And so many times people are put on trial for terrible crimes, robbery, murder, so forth. And many, many people over the years have been convicted on the weight of circumstantial evidence. It has sent people to prison for years. It has sent people to the gas chamber, the electric chair, the weight of circumstantial evidence where a jury reaches a conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt that an individual is guilty. Well, let's use the same process, and let's see if we can use circumstantial evidence to reach some very reasonable, logical conclusions. So let's dive right in. The theory of evolution. And this is the theory that organic life emerged spontaneously from inorganic elements. The first forms of life were one-cell microbes that evolved over time into all current life forms. The process involved a process of genetic mutation and survival of the fittest, which is also called natural selection. The entire process was random and directionless. All living creatures are modified descendants of a common ancestor that lived long ago. Okay, now, Excuse me? Happens all of a sudden. Now, let me qualify myself. In many ways, I feel like I'm probably one of the very unqualified to present this because by nature I am a very simple-minded man. Physics and chemistry, especially physics, gets very deep, very complicated for me very quickly. It's like you start out in a swimming pool on the shallow end, and that shallow end is about 3 feet in length, and all of a sudden you just drop off on the deep end. Well, that's the way it was for me when I was doing all my research and study. So a lot of these concepts, it took some time for me to wrap my mind around some of this stuff. But anyway, the core of Darwinism is that evolution is natural selection. If this is true, there is no role for God. Remember what we showed on the previous screen, that the process is random and directionless. So everything that exists is a result of a process of random occurrences. And the point of Darwinism is that there is no need for God because nature can do all the creating by itself. Now, Darwin didn't say this, but a critical look at his theory, and that's your conclusion. Okay, now speculate with me for just a minute. What if Darwinism, the evolution, is true? What if evolution is true? If evolution is true, then complete the sentence. Okay, all right. And who can add to that? Yes. Mm-hmm. And Larry? Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. And if there is no God, then someone complete the sentence. Exactly. So, if evolution is true, there is no God. The Bible is wrong. Mankind is nothing more than a sophisticated primate species. Man decides what is moral, what is right, what is wrong. We have no soul. There is no afterlife. And we are presented with a world that is purposeless and void of meaning. Now, isn't that inspiring? Now, Charles Darwin published a book, Origin of the Species, in which he proposed that all forms of life are the result of a natural process of natural selection, survival of the species. And this is a copy of one of his sketches of the tree of life with his notes. So at the bottom of this tree, you see like the original common ancestor. And then you go up the tree and you see how we have life branching out. And so you can, and I saw I remember seeing a sophisticated improvement of that tree in a set of World Book encyclopedias that my mom bought for me. It was, I think, a 1960 edition. But I really enjoyed reading it back when I was an adolescent and a teenager. And on days I would be home from school sick or something, I'd be just bored out of my mind because it would just be soap operas on TV. I would pull an encyclopedia at random. I just enjoy reading them. And I remember seeing an updated version of this, and where at the top of the branches, all around on the periphery, you see all the animal species that exist today. And up there at the top, you see the primates, and at the very top, you see man. Now, Darwin postulated that the fossil record would prove his theory. Now, fossil collection was a new science back in the 1850s. We had only been collecting fossils for a few decades. Now, let's fast forward to today, and mankind has been collecting and studying fossils for, I would say, at least 200 years, possibly more. Let me advance. So Darwin's theory predicted a long history of gradual divergence in animal species from a common ancestor. The differences would slowly become bigger and bigger until we arrive at the wide variety of species we see today. Now, when I was in college, I took Biology 101, 102, and then 105, which 105 was cellular biology. Somewhere along the way, I was presented with the theory of evolution. I think it was in cellular biology. And the professor explained it this way. Say you have an animal species across a very large geographic area. And over time, and we're talking about millions of years, that species becomes separated into two groups, maybe by a mountain range or a continental group, continental drift, where one group is on this part of a landmass that goes this way, and the other part is on the landmass that goes that way, and they gradually change. Perhaps the environment becomes a rainforest, or the environment becomes a semi-desert or a desert. And so they gradually change over time to adapt to their changing environment. And so he predicted that the fossil record would see a slow, progressive change in a species over time. Anyone care to guess how the fossil record bears out? Did he predict the fossil record correctly? Anyone want to take a guess? It is no, yes. The missing link, yes. The fossil record goes completely contrary to Darwin's theory. Species with completely different body designs appear suddenly, completely developed. Now, in my research, now remember, you've got the mindset of a naturalist. So you're looking at the age of Earth, and you have the concept that Earth is very old, 4.5 billion years old, and you're looking into different geological periods of time. And there's one particular period of time called the Cambrian period that they think happened about 540 million years ago. And up until the Cambrian period, there were some fossil records, very unimpressive, simple forms of life, worms and a few other little things, very unimpressive. But then, in the Cambrian period, just bang, suddenly, vertebrates appear with nothing leading up to them, just suddenly all the way developed. And that has been a consistent record that people have found in studying fossils over the years. Now, the cutting edge, look, now, I also read that what they are doing now, they have abandoned the search of, no, they're not, they haven't abandoned it, but they are taking another track. They're looking at the DNA record of animals now, seeing if they can trace a lineage not through fossils, but through the DNA record. And the jury is still out on that. But the fossil record that has been detected so far has completely turned Charles Darwin's theory completely on its head, or at least his tree of life has just been completely proven wrong. Okay, and by the way, I was presented with Darwin's tree of life when I was taking biology. Another thing that I was presented with was the Stanley Miller experiment of 1953. For those of you who studied biology in high school or college, was this presented to you by any chance? Okay. Mm-hmm. And that is a good, I respect that teacher for making that statement, because there's a lot of reason for doubt. I was presented with this. As recently as, I believe, 2004, I was looking at a website from Public Broadcasting System, and it appears that they had some sort of a TV show back in 2004 presenting this information. Now they do put in some qualifying things, but anyway, the hypothesis that Stanley Miller came up with is that the primitive atmosphere and conditions of primitive Earth could have produced chemical reactions that produced organic compounds from simple inorganic elements. Water vapor, ammonia, methane, and hydrogen were the gases used. They were mixed in a flask, and electric sparks were shot into the gases to simulate lightning. The results, this was over about a 1-week period of time, was a red substance that contained organic amino acids. The belief was that scientists were on the brink of discovering how organic substances had been naturally formed, could have organized and formed the first single-cell microbes. Okay, amino acids. These are naturally occurring substances, and about 20 of them are organic, and that's as far as I'm going with amino acids. Here's a diagram of his experiment, where if you start on the lower left, you see this flask of boiling water, and the water vapor goes up and then over to the right, and it goes down into a globe that is filled with the gases, and so you have a gaseous mix of water vapor, ammonia, methane, hydrogen, and then you see the little electrodes penetrating the globe, and there are some electric sparks. And then down at the bottom, you have this collection of water with organic compounds at the end of the experiment. It was siphoned off, and it was this red goo, and so they saw organic amino acids, and the reaction was, aha, we're on the track of how life spontaneously originated from inorganic substances. Okay, now, I told Randy I was going to ask him a question because he has a background in chemistry and physics, plus the medical background. Okay, granted we have some amino acids. How far are we away from creating life, in your opinion, at that stage? Excellent. That is the correct answer, because we're not even going to talk about enzymes and DNA, and we're not going to, but what is necessary for life, well, anyway, problems with the Miller experiment. Miller was, in the coming decades or subsequent decades, naturalists believed that he was wrong about his assumption of the early primitive atmosphere. And so some revisions to this gaseous mixture were done, and they would see what the result was. And the products were formaldehyde, cyanide, which are poisonous substance. Formaldehyde, by the way, is one of the primary ingredients in embalming fluid. Even if the Miller experiment were correct, it would still be a very long way from creating a living cell. The right number of the right kinds of amino acids would have to link up to create. Yes, Randy? Mm-hmm. 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 And is a good point, because as we're going through these images that people think support evolution, there are so many young people sitting in high school classes and college classes with fresh young minds that buy into this and make that jump, where it's presented as this is probably what happened, and they latch onto this, and that gives them their mindset for the rest of their life. Yes. Mm-hmm. 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 Well, and I totally agree with all that. You're right on target. it would take the right number of the right kinds of amino acids, and they would have to link up in the right way to create a protein molecule. And then you'd have to have dozens of those protein molecules in the right sequence to create a cell. So you have to have probability upon unlikely probability on top of unlikely probability. And in my mind, I was trying to put this in a term that, for me to, well, like Randy put it in a real good term, light years away or from infinity. It was like, imagine you're taking this incredible road trip across North America. You're starting out in Key West, Florida, and you're going to drive across the continent to Anchorage, Alaska. And going this far on this experiment is just like backing out of the driveway and maybe going to the first stop sign in your neighborhood. That's as far as you go right there. What are the characteristics of life? 5 characteristics of life. This is Biology 101. Life must reproduce. It must do what? Something else. Take in nutrients. Give off waste products. Carry on some type of respiration, whether it's aerobic or anaerobic. React to stimuli and then reproduce itself. So you get this organized protein. How do you get that spark of life into that? And in looking back, I've always had a skeptical nature about myself. And I remember thinking about that Miller experiment. And I'm thinking, okay, he's got the amino acids. How do you go from point A to point B to where a cell organizes itself and then starts doing all of this? I think that's incomprehensible to me. Okay, the next thing we're going to take a look at . Okay, and now you're in territory that's above my head. I have now strayed off into that deep end of the pool. Okay, now another scientist we're going to take a look at his work is Ernst Heckel. He lived in the 1830s. He died in 1919. And he came up with this theory of recapitulation. And here are some of his sketches that he had printed out. Now, this is he was looking at embryos. And he was looking at embryos of vertebrates. And of course, vertebrates would include fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. All life forms that have a backbone. And he theorized, or he said that the embryonic state of many animals, or animals in general, represented in their early development a common ancestor that lived long ago. And he submitted this as evidence that supported evolution. Did any of you in your biology studies, if you studied biology, was this presented to you? It was to me. All these were presented to me in biology. I took biology at Jefferson State, and then somewhere along the way, either in Biology 102 or 105, all this was presented to me. Well, the problem is he had a certain amount of fudge factor involved. He was later called out on some of his colleagues where some of the diagrams that he used, they were embellished, and he used the same wood block to make some of the diagrams that he printed up, and then came behind and made a little some changes. And he didn't look at an embryo in its early development. He looked at an embryo in the middle development. When life forms in a vertebrate, a fertilized egg, it goes through the embryonic state first, and then if you look like at a mammal, then it will progress into a fetus. Randy, is that the next step from embryo? Then the next step is fetus, I believe. So anyway, but we're looking just at the embryonic stage. We now know that in the embryonic stage, the early embryonic stage that Ernst Heckel was proposing, there's actually a very wide range of appearances of the way different animals look. And it's more like just envision an hourglass, a wide hourglass that has a broad spectrum at the top. And then as they develop through the midpoint, they do come in and they do, for a short time, look similar, and then they quickly spread out again and they start forming the shapes that we recognize. So this is something that really was pretty well early discounted. Nevertheless, it is still presented in high school and college classes as late as, at the latter part of the 20th century, we know it's still being presented. You can still find this, and there are studies about the recapitulation theory. People, they know that this isn't true, but still there is the study of embryonic development and trying to link it to evolution. Okay, now we're going to go on to some really cool stuff. Evidences of physics. And we're going to talk about the Anthropic Principle first, and that's an overall observation of the extraordinary balancing of the fundamental laws and parameters of physics and the initial conditions of the universe. Over the past few decades, scientists have discovered that just about everything about the basic structure of the universe is balanced on a razor's edge for life to exist. And I threw in a quote from a scientist, Patrick Glenn, where he said, "All the seemingly arbitrary and unrelated constants in physics have one thing in common. They have precisely the values needed in order to have a universe capable of having life." I also included some quotes from scientists. Is it a pure coincidence that the laws of nature are such that life is possible? Might this not be an important clue to the nature and destiny of humanity? Evidence for an intelligent designer becomes more compelling the more we understand about our carefully crafted habitat. Another person said, "Through my scientific work, I have come to believe more and more strongly that the physical universe is put together with an ingenuity so astonishing that I cannot accept it merely as a brute fact. I cannot believe that our existence in this universe is a mere quirk of fate, an accident of history, an incidental blip in the great cosmic drama." And another person said, "I do not believe that any scientist who examined the evidence would fail to draw the inference that the laws of nuclear physics have been deliberately designed with regard to the consequences they produce inside stars. A universe aiming at the production of man implies a mind directing it." And finally, though man is not at the physical center of the universe, he appears to be at the center of its purpose. Now, these are quotes from, there are a large number of scientists that started out in their career as atheists, and they have moved away from being an atheist to, I'm not saying they have become believers in the God that we read about in Scripture. Some have. Others have just moved toward a the philosophy of deism that we discussed on Wednesday night. But what those statements are referring to, some of these statements that these are alluding to, is the four basic forces in nature. The strong nuclear force, and this is the force that holds atoms together. The weak nuclear force, the electromagnetic force, and gravity. Here's a diagram of an atom, and you see in the center you have two red protons. Now, if something has a positive charge, two objects that have a positive charge come together, what do they want to do? Separate, repel. Have you ever played with magnets and you link up the two positive ends together with the two negative ends and you try to force those magnets to come together? It's kind of hard to do. You have to really maintain a tight grip to hold those magnets together. And if you loosen up, they're going to slide because they're constantly pushing away. It's either opposite or they want to go sideways, one of the two. Well, the behavior of subatomic particles overcomes that force and forces the protons to stay together. Why is that important? If we don't have atoms that can stay together like this, then we're reduced to having hydrogen or helium, and that's it. And we have there's the weak nuclear force that I never really could quite wrap my mind around, but I understand it in the concept of material decay. We've all heard of carbon-14 and how it's used to determine how old something is. If we dig up something out of an archaeological dig that's organic, whether a piece of cloth or an animal bone, we can do carbon-14 dating on that article and determine how old it is. It's because carbon-14 is a radio form of carbon that is formed naturally in our atmosphere. It's absorbed by plants and therefore enters the food chain, either by animals directly eating the plants or animals eating other animals that have eaten plants. And there's a continuous intake of carbon-14 and it decays. And so when an animal dies, then of course the intake of carbon-14 stops, and then it's just the carbon-14 within the body or within the substance starts to decay. And with it being radioactive, we know what the half-life is. So it's this weak force that allows for carbon-14 to decay over a set period of time from carbon-14 to nitrogen-14. And that's as far as I can go. Any further than that, it was really difficult for me to wrap my mind around it. Yes? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And thank you for saying that, because it did remind me of one thing that I overlooked, is that force is finely tuned too. They have realized that if it were any weaker or any stronger, it would have terrible consequences for the atomic construction and for life in general. Life would not exist if that nuclear force were any stronger or weaker. The same goes for the weak nuclear force. It's fine-tuned very precisely, and there is no obvious reason why any of these forces have the strength or the weakness that they have. You look at it, and it's like, this is the force that it has, and that's it. No obvious reason why. Yes? Mm-hmm. 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 And I'd like to add to that by saying that as you decrease water temperature, and I'm talking about liquid water, as you decrease the temperature, it becomes more and more dense until you reach the freezing point, and then the density decreases that allows it to float. Do you mind answering that one, Randy? Because Mhm. 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 Yes. Mhm. And the point I want to reiterate is how these natural forces are so precisely fine-tuned that if any of these four were any weaker, any stronger than what they are, life wouldn't be possible. And keep in mind, we're looking through the eyes of a naturalist, someone who believes in the old Earth concept. The last one we want to take a look at, we're going to skip electromagnetic force and jump to gravity. This is an illustration of the force of gravity, how it bends space, how a mass will bend space. And that bending of space illustrates the drawing power of gravity. And it's the weakest of all the natural forces. However, gravity is on a very precise razor's edge. And they have calculated that if it were any weaker, life couldn't exist. That on Earth right now, if gravity were dialed back one little bit, that the forces underneath the Earth's crust would break up the crust and the world would just come to an end in just some sort of fiery cataclysm, because the crust would not be able to hold the Earth together. If it were any stronger, the core collapses, the crust collapses on the core. Terrible things happen to the sun that I can't recall right now. But anyway, you get the point. Life would not be able to exist. The cosmological constant. I'm glad that the video portion worked on this. This is the only way I could really wrap my mind around the cosmological constant. Okay, let me just put it this way. They discovered several decades ago that the universe is not static. The galaxies are moving away from each other. And then in the 1990s, they discovered that the galaxies, that movement away from each other is accelerating. Okay, space is a vacuum. So this little diagram here that I have, it represents a piston. And imagine that you start off with a piston where the atmosphere has mostly been pressed out and you have just a little small residue left. And then you manually pull that piston back. What kind of force are you going to feel as you pull that piston back and you've got empty air on the other side? What kind of increasing resistance? And that's what they were thinking about. Okay, but the universe is still expanding, and so something is overcoming that increasing resistance, and that's called the cosmological constant. And that is the cutting edge study of physics, where they know it exists. At first they thought it would have to be a strong force, but then they realized it's actually a weak force. It's just strong enough to overcome that pulling force of gravity. They realized if it were any stronger, the stars couldn't have formed a long time ago. If it were any weaker, the universe would then collapse on itself. So anyway, that is okay. That was the second bell. We're going to have to stop right here, and Wednesday night we're going to talk about doubt.